On a scorching midsummer day, the streets of Fairhill, a small town in the Midwest, were sweltering under the intense heat. The sun had been blazing since morning, and the air felt thick and stifling. Under that merciless sun, 75-year-old Mrs. Margaret Parker wandered aimlessly. She had once been one of Fairhill's most prominent figures, owning half the properties in the downtown district. Now, she couldn't even find her way home. Sweat poured down her face like rain, and she was short of breath. Mrs. Parker had no idea where she was or why she was there. Her mind was blank, unable to recall her home's location or the reason she had ended up on that street. The memories of her past, of raising her children and acquiring properties in downtown Fairhill with her late husband, had faded into a distant fog. Passers-by cast wary glances at her as she stumbled by, her clothes stained and her hair in disarray. Some muttered to each other, their eyes following her, but Margaret didn't notice. As she trudged along under the blistering sun, a growing thirst gnawed at her. She desperately craved a sip of water, but her pockets were empty. That's when she spotted a familiar building in the distance. A fleeting thought crossed her mind. That's the bank, isn't it? The sight of the red-bricked Fairhill Savings and Loan stirred something deep in her memory. Margaret shuffled toward the bank and stepped inside. The cool blast of air from the air conditioning swept over her face, offering a brief respite from the heat. For a moment, it seemed like her mind was clearing up. However, her sense of relief was short-lived. The moment the bank's patrons noticed her, their expressions darkened. Some people stepped back, avoiding her entirely. Others whispered behind their hands or openly stared. With trembling hands, Margaret gathered her courage and approached the counter. "Excuse me," she said in a raspy voice. "Could I have a glass of water? This place feels familiar." The young teller, a woman in her late 20s named Rebecca, gave her a cold, dismissive look. "Ma'am, this isn't a public service center," she replied with barely concealed disdain. "Please leave." Margaret pleaded, her voice cracking. "Wait, I remember something. Please, just a moment." Before she could finish, Rebecca turned to the security guard. "Tom, could you help her out? She's disturbing the customers." The guard walked up and took Margaret's arm gently but firmly. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but you have to leave," he said. "You can't stay here." Margaret stumbled as she was escorted outside. She fell hard onto the concrete steps, sitting there for a moment in stunned silence. Then, as if struck by lightning, a memory came rushing back. "This is the bank where I have my money. Millions of dollars." Tears welled up in her eyes as the weight of her humiliation sank in. She had been a major figure in Fairhill, owning numerous buildings downtown. Yet here she was, treated like a vagrant. Her pride shattered, and it felt as if something inside her had broken. Margaret sat on the curb, unable to move. The pain in her chest hurt far worse than the bruise forming on her hip. Passers-by continued to look at her with a mixture of curiosity and pity, but now she felt every one of their stares. "I have millions of dollars in this bank," she muttered under her breath. It was the fortune she and her late husband had built together, property by property, over decades, a legacy she had intended to leave for her children. And yet, this was how the bank treated her. Through the glass doors, she could see the young teller smiling brightly as she served another customer. A pang of sadness and anger welled up in Margaret's heart. 10 years ago, the staff would bow and call me ma'am with respect. If only my husband were still alive, this would never have happened. Brushing herself off, Margaret slowly stood up. Her legs trembled, but she refused to back down. She walked steadily, finding her way back to her large Victorian house on Elm Street, the one she had lived in for decades. Along the way, She passed the various buildings she owned in downtown Fairhill. For the first time in a long while, her vision cleared. The signs on the shops became sharp, and even the expressions of the tenants were visible. It seemed that the fog of her dementia had momentarily lifted. Once she reached her home, Margaret picked up the phone with determined hands and called her attorney, Mr. James Whitmore. "Hello, Jim. It's Margaret," she said, her voice trembling. "I need to tell you what happened at the bank today." Her lawyer listened carefully, his voice calm but serious. "I see. That's completely unacceptable. Let's go there together tomorrow and handle this." Feeling a sense of relief, Margaret hung up the phone. She opened her wardrobe, searching for the perfect outfit. She chose a powder blue dress that her husband used to love and began carefully ironing it. "Tomorrow will be different," she said firmly. "I won't let them treat me like that again." The next morning, Margaret's house was buzzing with energy. She stood at her mirror longer than usual, combing her silver hair and applying light makeup. The powder blue dress she had pressed was immaculate. She looked at herself in the mirror, no longer seeing the frail woman from the day before. At exactly 10 a.m., her lawyer arrived. "Morning, Mrs. Parker." He greeted her with a reassuring smile. "Are you ready?" "I've never been more ready," she replied, her eyes filled with resolve. On the way to the bank, James cautiously asked, "Are you sure you want to withdraw everything?" "Every last dollar," she said without hesitation. When they arrived at Fairhill Savings and Loan, the previous day's memory flashed through Margaret's mind. But today was different. She walked into the bank with her head held high, her elegant dress swaying with each confident step. Every eye turned toward her, but this time it wasn't out of pity or judgment. It was curiosity and awe. Margaret headed straight to the teller who had turned her away. "Do you remember me?" she asked, her voice calm but commanding. Rebecca looked confused. "I'm sorry, but..." Before she could finish, James stepped forward. "This is Mrs. Margaret Parker, one of the largest property owners in Fairhill. Yesterday, you threw her out when she asked for a glass of water." Rebecca's face turned pale. Her eyes darted nervously to the branch manager, who had already rushed out from his office. "Mrs. Parker, I'm so sorry for what happened. That should never have happened," the manager stammered, bowing his head repeatedly. Margaret raised her hand to stop him. "No need for an apology. I'm here to close all my accounts." The manager's face went ashen. "Please, Mrs. Parker, we deeply regret what happened. How can we make this right?" Margaret's expression remained firm. "No more words. Close everything, my savings, my rental income accounts. I won't leave a single dollar here." It took hours for the bank staff to complete the process. Margaret sat calmly as they worked, unfazed by their frantic efforts. "Just to confirm, Mrs. Parker," the trembling teller said, "you're withdrawing your entire balance of $10 million and closing all 20 of your rental income accounts." "Yes," she answered resolutely. The manager tried once more to persuade her, but Margaret stood her ground. By the time she walked out of the bank with James by her side, her steps were light. The humiliation from the day before was gone, replaced by a sense of pride and freedom. In the car, James asked, "Which bank will you choose next?" "I haven't decided yet," Margaret replied. "But this time, I'll make sure it's a place that values people, not just their money." Meanwhile, chaos erupted at Fairhill Savings and Loan. The branch manager called an emergency meeting. "Who turned Mrs. Parker away?" he demanded. The room fell silent until Rebecca nervously raised her hand. I did," she admitted, her voice barely audible. The manager sighed heavily. "Do you understand what you've done? Mrs. Parker's accounts made up nearly 40% of our branch's total deposits." The staff gasped. The manager continued, "And her rental income brought in thousands of dollars in monthly fees. We've lost it all because of one terrible mistake. News of the incident spread quickly through Fairhill. Other banks began competing for Margaret's business, offering exclusive interest rates and personalized services. "If you bank with us, Mrs. Parker, we'll treat you like family," they promised. But Margaret wasn't easily swayed. "I'm not interested in superficial kindness. I'm looking for genuine people who respect others," she told them. Meanwhile, the merchants in downtown Fairhill rallied around her. Many of them closed their accounts at Fairhill Savings and Loan. "If they treated Mrs. Parker like that, why should we trust them with our money?" they said. Within a month, dozens of businesses had moved their accounts to other banks. The once thriving Fairhill Savings and Loan was left reeling. The bank's headquarters sent an audit team to investigate. "How could you lose our top depositor?" they demanded. The manager endured the barrage of criticism, but the damage was already done. Rebecca was summoned by HR. "You judged a customer by her appearance. That mistake cost the bank millions," the HR director scolded her. By early autumn, Margaret finally found a new bank, a small, community-based institution that had been part of Fairhill for decades. The branch manager greeted her warmly. "It's an honor to have you with us, Mrs. Parker," he said, extending his hand. Margaret smiled for the first time in days. From that moment on, she became part of the community bank's family. The lesson Margaret left behind became a lasting story in Fairhill. Other banks revised their customer service protocols, using her experience as a case study. "Never judge someone by their appearance," the training manuals read. "True service comes from the heart." At her new bank, a special lounge was created just for Margaret. "Stop by any time, Mrs. Parker. This is your second home," the staff told her. Meanwhile, the merchants in Fairhill continued to treat Margaret with care and respect. "Ma'am, it's getting chilly. Come in for a warm drink," said the owner of a nearby cafe. Sometimes, when her dementia symptoms flared up, they escorted her home. "Don't worry, Mrs. Parker. We're here for you," they assured her. Rebecca, the young teller, was haunted by her mistake. Every night, she whispered, "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Parker," but it was too late to undo the past. Margaret decided to turn her experience into something meaningful. She donated a large portion of her fortune to build a memory care center for dementia patients. "I don't want anyone else to wander the streets like I did," she explained. The Margaret Parker Memory Care Center was built on a hill overlooking Fairhill. As it neared completion, townspeople came to express their gratitude. "You've changed so many lives, Mrs. Parker," they said. On the center's opening day, a large crowd gathered. Margaret, though her memory was fading, smiled brightly. It was a moment of transformation. Her pain had blossomed into hope for others. Her story spread far beyond Fairhill, inspiring people to treat others with dignity and compassion. Margaret's philosophy was simple but profound. A person's worth isn't in their bank account or appearance, it's in their heart. As the seasons changed, Margaret's legacy endured. She may have forgotten much of her life, but Fairhill never forgot her. On a snowy winter afternoon, Margaret sat by the window at the Memory Care Center, watching snowflakes fall. A faint smile appeared on her lips as a sweet memory flitted through her mind. Though the details faded, her heart remained full. And so, in the streets of Fairhill, Margaret Parker's story lived on, a story of resilience, kindness, and the power of true human connection. Even as the years passed, Margaret's name became synonymous with grace and generosity. She had taught the people of Fairhill that true wealth isn't in money, but in the kindness we share with one another.